Today we're going to start our lesson on the French Revolution, and we always start the French Revolution right after we finish the American Revolution. And the reason for that is the American Revolution and the Enlightenment will be a major cause of the French Revolution. So from 1789 to 1799, the French people are going to go to war against themselves, and that is the main difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The American Revolution was fought between American colonists and the British. The French Revolution is going to be basically fought between the French people and their king, and that's the main difference. Now, at the bottom of our slide here on our title slide, it says that if the Americans can do it, why can't we? You guys have to understand that one of the biggest upsets in the history of the world was the American colonists defeating the British Army in the American Revolution. The American Army had just been created. They were farmers with pitchforks going up against the greatest, most powerful army in the world, and the Americans won. So if the Americans can do it, why can't the French people do it against their own king? Now, to understand what's going on in France, we have to look at their social class structure. And the social class structure of France forever, before 1789 was called the Old Regime. The Old Regime was the social class structure. And the social classes of France were called estates. And there were three of them. The king was always at the top, and then three social classes right before the king. And that's how it's always been in France forever and ever before 1789. And if there's one word that we can use to describe the French social class structure before 1789 is inequality. So here's the Old Regime. So the first estate, or the first social class in France before 1789, was called the First Estate. And you can see there that it made up a very small percentage of the population. 0.45% of the population belonged to this social class. The First Estate in France forever had been the Catholic Church, the clergy of the Catholic Church, the archbishops, the bishops, the priests, and so on, in the Catholic Church in France. Right below the king in France were the members of the church. Now, the church didn't have to pay any taxes. And in those days, if you recall, the Catholic Church was one of the, if not the richest organization on earth. But in France, this group that held the most power right below the king in France didn't have to pay any taxes and owned a huge chunk of land. About 10% of the land belonged to the church, the Catholic Church in France. This is the First Estate. The Second Estate, as you can see a little pattern forming here with the first two social classes, made up about 1.22% of the population, a very small percentage of the population, and it was called the Second Estate. The Second Estate was made up of the nobility. So if you were a member of the army, or government, if you were a general in the army, like the Marquis de Lafayette, who fought alongside George Washington during the American Revolution, or if you were a member of government, you were considered a noble. And the nobility basically didn't have hardly any power in the history of France because all of the absolute monarchs of France, all of the kings of France, King Louis XIV we did work on, crushed the power of the nobles. They had no power whatsoever, and the nobles paid very few taxes. So if they had a complaint, they would want a little more say in government and probably to not pay any taxes at all. So if you're a mathematician, you can see that the two most powerful groups of people in France before 1789 that ranked just below the king do not even make up 2% of their total population. Well, that leaves a huge third social class, which we call the Third Estate. 98% of the population belonged to the weakest social class in France before 1789. This class was so big that it in itself had to be broken into three different groups. The first group is a name that is a little bit familiar to you. It's called the bourgeoisie. Now, the bourgeoisie was the name of a middle class that formed in Europe, not just France, but in Europe during the Middle Ages, during the growth of medieval towns. Now, this was your middle class. These were your workers. These were your merchants, storekeepers, store owners, and that type of person belonged to the bourgeoisie. Within this third estate, another group, which the third estate was broken into because it was so big, were the laborers and the artisans. The skilled craft workers and the laborers were the second group within the third estate. And then everybody else in France, making up just under 80% of the population almost, were peasants, were poor, were hungry, did not live in very hygienic places. They had zero rights whatsoever. So just by getting a quick little description of the social classes in France, which we call the estates, the old regime, the estates in France, you can see that there's tons of inequality just in the numbers before we even dissect this groups any more closer. Now, let's go ahead and let's continue with the lesson and talk about the causes of the French Revolution. Well, we just got done with a major event called the Enlightenment, okay? Which its slogan, if you recall, was free and equal. Now, the Enlightenment started in France in the 1700s, and all those French philosophers that we talked about, like Montesquieu and Voltaire and Diderot, well, they were speaking out in France, all right? So naturally, the Enlightenment is going to be a cause of the French Revolution. I already told you this in detail from the start, that the American Revolution is going to be a cause of the French Revolution. If you recall, the French Revolution starts shortly after, and in some cases indirectly during, the end of the American Revolution, okay? Total discontent among the estates. The church wanted more power. The church wanted more land. The nobility wanted more power. The nobility didn't want to pay as many taxes. The third estate, the third social class, wanted any kind of rights whatsoever, which we'll talk a little bit more in detail about during our next lesson. So total unhappiness among the estates will cause the French Revolution. France in the 1700s experienced a growth in their population. And whenever a king's country experiences a growth in population, that king has to answer some questions. How are we going to feed all these people? How are we going to house all these people? How are we going to protect these people? How are we going to have enough jobs for these people to have money in their pockets? And the French kings did not do a very good job answering these questions because of a growth in their population. Well, France also, coincidentally, in the 1700s, is in a huge financial crisis. Huge financial crisis. They are in war debt. They had been fighting all over the world in the 7 Years' War, which it was called in Europe, and the French and Indian War, as it was called in North America, where it was fought in Pennsylvania and Ohio. It cost a lot of money for that. And if you recall, we learned very clearly that the French did help the American colonists in the American Revolution. So because of the American Revolution, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, France in the 1700s has a huge war debt, and they are in trouble financially. On top of that, they experienced a time period of deficit spending. Deficit spending. It's when you spend more money than you take in. And that is a huge problem in France. So the French government is broke, and that's going to be a cause of the French Revolution. Well, another simple reason why the French Revolution is going to start is because absolute monarchs had been forever in charge of France. People forever in France have always been ruled by a king, been ruled by someone, and that starts in 428 AD when the Franks came to town. Their king Clovis, and later on, remember a guy named Charlemagne, all right, during our early part of the Middle Ages lessons, when the Franks that were left over from invading the old western part of the Roman Empire, they were ruled by kings. And Clovis was considered the first king. Well, Louis XIV, who was the longest ruling tenured king in the history of Europe, had just ruled from 1643 to 1715. The people didn't mind King Louis XIV. Remember, he did the Palace of Versailles and is known as being a great king that was beloved. But the problem for King Louis XIV and the French people is King Louis XIV is going to die. And King Louis XV is going to take the reign. And he's going to rule for a very long time in France from 715 to 774. AD. And he was hated. He's one of the main reasons why France is in financial crisis because of deficit spending. So at this point, hopefully you have a real good understanding of the social class structure in France and also the causes of the French Revolution.